in the U.S.
These are enemies of the state.
Is our war.
What if Joe is no longer being held just to get information, but is actually being taken directly into Russia? Because after everything we saw in episode 4, the situation has become much more dangerous than a simple kidnapping. Joe was moved by plane before her team could rescue her, her location disappeared, and now the biggest question is where the Russians are taking her next. And if the episode 5 trailer is giving us the clues correctly, Oleksandra could be much more important to Joe's fate than we first thought. Is she really helping the Americans, or has she been playing everyone from the beginning? And if Joe really ends up in Russian hands, how long can she survive before the Russians force her to reveal everything she knows? At this point, I think episode 5 could completely change the direction of season 3. So let's break down what we know, what the trailer could be telling us, and most importantly, what Joe's dark fate could actually be. First, we need to go back to the biggest problem from episode 4, because everything in episode 5 is going to depend on what happened to Joe after she was taken from the hangar. The rescue operation came extremely close to finding her, but the team arrived too late. All they found was Joe's blood, several Russian operatives, and the number of the plane that had taken her away. And honestly, this is what makes the situation so terrifying. The Russians didn't simply capture Joe and leave her somewhere. They had a plan for moving her, and turning off the aircraft's transponder made it much harder for the Americans to track her. At this point, I think the most important question is not whether Joe will be tortured again. We already know that she is being pressured for information. The real question is what happens when the Russians realize that keeping Joe inside a hidden location is no longer enough. Joe knows too much about American operations, Lioness targets, and the people involved in these missions. If she reaches a secure Russian location, the pressure on her could become much worse because the Russians would have time to break her down psychologically as well as physically. And this is where Oleksandra becomes extremely interesting. If she really is connected to Joe's transfer, then we need to ask ourselves why. We already know that Oleksandra is not someone we can completely trust. She has connections to both sides, she understands how intelligence operations work, and she is exactly the type of person who could give the Americans information while secretly protecting her own interests. So if she is involved in Joe being taken toward Russia, I don't think we should immediately assume that she is doing it because she wants Joe dead. In fact, I think there could be a much bigger plan behind it. What if Oleksandra is trying to move Joe into Russia because she knows something the Americans don't? What if Joe's capture is actually connected to the hidden network that the Lioness team has been investigating? The official episode 5 synopsis says Joe leads the hunt as her team exposes a hidden network operating through covert handlers, while Caitlin and Westfield work to assess the threat. And that makes me think Joe's kidnapping may be connected to something much larger than the Russian agents we have already seen. But there is another possibility that honestly scares me even more. What if Joe is being used as bait? The Russians know that the Americans will do almost anything to get her back. Kyle has already crossed serious lines trying to find her, and Caitlin has made it clear that the situation could create enormous political consequences if Joe ends up in the wrong hands. So if the Russians understand how desperate the Lioness team is becoming, they could use Joe's location to force the Americans into making a mistake. And this is exactly why I think episode 5 could be one of the most dangerous episodes of the season. Joe may believe that she is fighting to survive, but the people around her could be fighting a completely different war. Kyle is becoming more aggressive, Caitlin is becoming more willing to accept extreme decisions, and the Russians appear to be several steps ahead. At this point, Joe isn't just trying to escape captivity. She may have to figure out who she can actually trust before she even gets the chance to go home. Now, this is where things get even more interesting because I think Oleksandra could be the key to understanding what is really happening to Joe. We already know that she has information about Russian assets, but there is a very important detail from episode 4 that we cannot ignore. The Americans discovered that when Russian intelligence turns someone into an asset, the identity of that person is shared among different SVR handlers, but the identity of the handler who recruited them is kept secret. That means Oleksandra knows which people in her network were recruited by Russia, but she doesn't necessarily know who is controlling them. Joe's plan was to use exactly this weakness to identify the hidden handlers. And honestly, this makes Oleksandra much more dangerous than she first appeared. At this point, I think there are two completely different possibilities. The first is that Oleksandra is genuinely helping the Americans, but she has been forced into a situation where protecting herself requires making some very dangerous decisions. If that is the case, taking Joe toward Russia could actually be part of a bigger plan. Maybe Oleksandra knows that someone inside the Russian network is expecting Joe, and she believes getting her there is the only way to expose that person. But the second possibility is much darker. What if Oleksandra has been using the Americans this entire time? Remember, this is someone who understands both sides of this conflict. She knows how the Russians think, she understands how the Americans operate, and she knows exactly what information each side wants. That makes her the perfect person to manipulate everyone without being caught. And if she has decided to betray Joe, then Joe could already be walking directly into a trap without even realizing it. The reason I keep coming back to this theory is because Joe is too valuable to simply kill. The Russians don't just want revenge. They want information. Joe has spent years building Lioness operations and knows how the program works from the inside. She knows the people, the methods, and the weaknesses. So if the Russians really manage to take her into their territory, they could have one of the most valuable intelligence sources imaginable. And that is exactly why I don't think they will immediately try to kill her. Instead, I think they will try to break her. We already saw the Russians using psychological pressure against Joe, reminding her of the actions she had taken against them while they tortured her. That tells us they are not simply trying to hurt her physically. They are trying to make her question herself and weaken her mentally. And if Joe is taken somewhere deeper into Russian territory, that pressure could become much worse. But here's the thing that makes this situation even more dangerous: Joe is not the kind of person who gives information easily. She knows exactly what happens if she breaks. People around her could die, Lioness operations could be exposed, and an entire intelligence network could collapse. So even while she is being tortured, I think Joe will be looking for another way out. And this could connect directly to the hidden network mentioned in the official episode 5 synopsis. The episode is expected to follow Joe and her team as they expose a network operating through covert handlers, while Caitlin and Westfield try to understand the larger threat. So even though Joe is physically separated from her team, her kidnapping could actually become the thing that helps them discover who is behind everything. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if Joe deliberately gives the Russians just enough information to make them believe she is breaking. She has done dangerous things before, and this could be the ultimate intelligence game. Maybe Joe isn't trying to escape immediately. Maybe she is trying to discover where she has been taken, who is controlling the operation, and why they need her alive. And if Oleksandra really is involved in taking Joe toward Russia, then the biggest question becomes very simple: is Oleksandra Joe's way out, or is she the person who is sending her deeper into the trap? Because if Oleksandra has betrayed her, Joe may have already lost the most important advantage she had, knowing who her enemy actually is. Now, while Joe is fighting for her life, there is another problem developing back home, and honestly, I think Kyle could become one of the biggest dangers to the entire operation. After what he did in episode 4, Kyle has already shown that he is willing to cross lines that other people on the team would never cross. He killed one Russian operative after getting the information he wanted, and then simply moved on as if nothing had happened. At this point, Kyle is no longer just helping the team find Joe. He is becoming someone who believes that the normal rules don't apply to him anymore. And that could become a serious problem in episode 5. What makes this even more interesting is that Kyle actually believes he is doing the right thing. From his point of view, every second they waste gives the Russians more time with Joe. If Joe breaks and gives them information about the Lioness program, countless people could be put in danger. So Kyle has convinced himself that extreme methods are necessary. But the problem is that once someone starts believing that the mission justifies everything, there is almost no limit left. And we already saw a preview of this attitude in episode 4. Kyle didn't just threaten the Russian operative. He used fear and violence to get what he wanted, and even after getting the information, he still pulled the trigger. That tells me episode 5 could push Kyle even further. If another Russian target refuses to talk, I don't think Kyle is going to suddenly become patient. In fact, I think he may become even more aggressive because Joe is still missing. At this point, the biggest question is whether Caitlin will finally stop him. Because until now, Caitlin has been willing to accept a lot of Kyle's behavior because she knows what is at stake. But there is a difference between doing whatever is necessary to save Joe and creating a situation where your own team becomes impossible to control. And this could be where Kyle and Caitlin finally have a serious confrontation. Caitlin is thinking about the bigger political consequences. Kyle is thinking about getting Joe back. Those are two completely different priorities. Caitlin knows that if the Lioness program is exposed, the consequences could reach the highest levels of the government. Kyle doesn't seem interested in that anymore. He just wants Joe alive. Honestly, I understand Kyle's anger. Joe is one of the most important people in his life, and watching her disappear while everyone sits around discussing political consequences must be incredibly frustrating. But I also think Kyle is becoming too emotional. And in intelligence work, that can be deadly. Meanwhile, the team is still trying to understand the hidden network connected to the Russian operation. The official episode 5 storyline focuses on Joe leading the hunt while her team exposes a network operating through covert handlers, while Caitlin and Westfield work to assess the threat. That tells us something very important. Even though Joe is physically captured, her operation is still moving forward. And here's the theory I find most interesting. What if Joe's capture is actually helping the team discover the final piece of the puzzle? Maybe the Russians think they have removed the biggest threat by taking Joe, but they have actually created a situation where Kyle, Caitlin, and the rest of the team are willing to go deeper than ever before. At this point, I think episode 5 could turn into a race between two sides. The Russians are trying to break Joe before she reveals anything, while the Americans are trying to identify the people controlling the network before Joe disappears completely. And somewhere in the middle of all of this is Oleksandra, who could either be the key to saving Joe or the person who has been leading everyone toward the biggest trap of the season. Because if Kyle is already willing to cross this many lines just to find Joe, imagine what he will do if he discovers that she has actually been taken into Russia. Now, after everything we have seen so far, I think episode 5 could finally show us just how serious Joe's situation really is. The official episode is titled The Idiot Army, and the story is expected to focus on Joe and her team exposing a hidden network operating through covert handlers while Caitlin and Westfield try to understand the larger threat. And honestly, that title makes me think the biggest enemy may not be the people we are currently watching. There could be another group behind everything, using Russian assets and American targets to create chaos from the inside. At this point, Joe's kidnapping could actually be part of that larger strategy. The enemy didn't just attack Joe randomly. They targeted her after her identity was compromised, and then they moved her before the Lioness team could reach her. Episode 4 ended with Joe being taken away by plane while the Americans were left trying to track an aircraft that had disappeared from radar. So if episode 5 begins with Joe already being moved deeper into enemy territory, the pressure on her team is going to become almost impossible to control. And this is where I think the Russia theory becomes really interesting. If Oleksandra is somehow involved in Joe's transfer, then Joe could be taken somewhere where the Americans cannot simply send a team to rescue her. Oleksandra has already been presented as a Ukrainian operative with knowledge of the Russian network, but the show has also made it clear that trusting her completely would be a mistake. At this point, I don't think the writers would make her role this complicated unless there was another major reveal coming. Maybe Oleksandra is trying to save Joe. Maybe she is trying to protect herself. Or maybe she has been playing both sides because she knows that the real enemy is much bigger than Russia. And honestly, that last possibility could explain why Joe's situation is becoming so complicated. But there is one thing I am almost certain about. Joe is not going to sit quietly and wait for someone to rescue her. She knows that the longer she stays alive, the more information her captors will try to extract from her. So I expect her to start looking for weaknesses. She could intentionally give them incomplete information, manipulate the people interrogating her, or even use their confidence against them. Jo has survived impossible situations before, and I don't think this is where she suddenly stops fighting. Meanwhile, Kyle and the rest of the team are going to have to move faster than ever.